I'm Richard Clay. I'm an art historian. I don't just study the creation of art, I study its destruction. In many ways, I study the history of art from below.
In this film, I'm going to tell the story of the French Revolution through the destruction of art, buildings and symbols. These are often used by those in power as weapons to enforce the status quo. In a revolution, the destruction and transformation of art and symbols is a way to turn the tables. It's called iconoclasm. The inside story of great revolutions can be uncovered through the smashed, altered and reshaped art of the past.
This is a story about art, it's a story about symbols, it's a story about the power of a monarchy, the power of the church, the power of aristocracy. Were the French revolutionaries just a mob? Why were their governments so afraid of them? This is the history of art. This is a story about the breaking of images. It's a story of the city being transformed through destruction, arguably the birth of the modern world.
The French Revolution of 1789 changed the world. Inspired by the Enlightenment notions of liberty, equality and brotherhood, the people of France tore control of their destiny from the king, nobility and church, giving birth to a new way of seeing the world around us. The revolution was a war whose battlefield was the visual world, where the symbols of royal, religious and aristocratic power had long controlled people's lives. Revolutionaries took these symbols and they destroyed them, creating a new political order. The word vandalism was invented to describe them. But I don't think that they were mindless barbarians. This battle over who controlled Paris began 24 kilometers outside the city, here in Versailles. Begun in 1632, King Louis's forebears expanded the Palace of Versailles to boast an astonishing 750 rooms with extravagant gardens covering 800 hectares. This building was the ultimate expression of French royal power.
Versailles is famous for being an extravagant piece of architecture with beautiful art. That's all true, but it's also the heart of Ancien Regime government. The king's apartments are a tiny fraction of this vast palace. The rest of it, it's administration, as well as servants, of course. And that's the important thing for the revolution. This is where government is done. This is the place to come to get decisions made.
For all its gold leaf, I'm not here to visit the Palace of Versailles, because the French Revolution effectively began nearby in this unassuming back street at the Royal Tennis Courts.
I've genuinely studied the revolution for almost half my life. I've never been in this space before. It's amazing. This is the truth. This is probably, for me at least, the most important place in recent French history.
In 1789, the French world of politics was in turmoil, divided into three groups called estates: the church at the top, nobility in the middle, and everybody else at the bottom. The French people were hungry and angry and taxed heavily by a cash-strapped elite.
France is effectively bankrupt. They keep losing wars. It's an expensive business. So the king says, I rule by divine right. I request that representatives of the three estates that make up French society come to Versailles and help me find a way of getting my accounts in order. The third estate and its champions in the press start to say, well, we're the vast majority of the French people. Surely we should have more representatives than everybody else. And when they tried to gather, the king refused to let them meet in the allotted space and found the doors locked. So they came to the tennis court and they swore an oath. They swore that they would sit in perpetuity until a constitution was written for France. This is the moment when constitutional politics is born. Jacques-Louis David's painting of the tennis court, it seems to be such a scene of consensus, all these arms thrusting to the centre towards Bailly, who's leading this oath. But it isn't entirely a scene of consensus. We've got a figure in the bottom right-hand corner who sits gesturing, firmly holding his arms to his chest. He is not going to raise his arm and swear this oath. It's too big. Robespierre stands clutching his chest. He's realising the enormity of the moment. He's not a renowned figure yet, but as we all know, he certainly will gain a reputation. And in the very centre, just at the feet of Bailly, there's Sieyès, who's such a key writer in the run-up to this event. And he sits as if in the eye of the storm, totally still, as if contemplating what his writing has unleashed. This is the birth of modern France. The world has been turned upside down. It's no longer about the divine right of kings. It's about power, sovereignty emanating from below. It's the power of the people.
For the first time in their history, the people had a representative government. The king, his nobles, and the church were losing their control over the people's lives and the world around them. A symbolic world that daily demonstrated the power of king, church, and aristocracy. With the assembly threatening the power of the king, rumours had spread that royalist troops were gathering outside Paris. The people were furious. Their target was a fortified gateway into Paris where astronomical customs duties were raised on imports into the city. Known as the Barrière de la Conférence, it no longer exists today. To Parisians, it was a hated building, loaded with economic and political significance.
The 12th of July 1789, the Parisians were walking out of Paris, and they were walking out of Paris to the Barrière de la Conférence on the route to Versailles. They wanted to get to Versailles, they wanted to see the king. But when they get there, they stop, and what they do is they attack the Barrière de la Conférence, which was just at this site. But really interestingly, this mob of vandals, this ignorant bunch of barbarians, had turned up with stonemasons and their tools. This sounds like they might have had a plan. Next to the barrier, there were statues. One of those statues, a female figure, has a shield. On the shield are the fleurs-de-lis. The fleurs-de-lis are the symbols of royal France. This is, as far as the crowd are concerned, a symbol of royal France. The stonemasons are there because they have a plan. Their plan is to decapitate the statue, and that is precisely what they do.
Many historians of the revolution cite this as the first example of mindless mobs committing acts of wanton vandalism. I disagree.
This moment of unrest, of violence, although nobody's wounded, but violence against property, isn't meaningless, it's meaningful. This statue at the gates of Paris in 1789 says to anybody who's entering Paris from Versailles that royalist France is like a body politic without a head. This powerful symbol is not the product of the behaviour of ignorant vandals.
Dr. Guillaume Mazot at the Sorbonne has been looking at what made the revolutionaries tick. Were they the violent mob of popular myth?
These popular protests
these, in some cases, armed protests. Are these the protests of mobs?
No, a lot of these protesters want to avoid violence, not because they are peaceful people, but they knew that the Royal Dragoons can stop this protest by violence. So we can say that it is a mob because these protesters are not influenced by only their emotion, their passions, their irrational behaviors, but they have what is quite new is that these protesters act in a very modern way.
What makes these protests of July 1789 so strikingly modern?
Because they are influenced by other revolutions of the 18th century. I mean by the American Revolution, but also by the European revolutions. And they perfectly knew what freedom means, what equality means. So it's not a mob, it's a political protest.
Deep within the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, prints from the period use the symbolism of the headless royal statue to show us the reality of the situation.
And this decapitated statue, it seems to me, is a key part of the composition. The king no longer is just the simple head of state that he once was. Now something new has to emerge. A member of the people standing where the head was. They are now sovereign.
Even today, transforming symbols of power through modification and destruction is still a provocative form of protest. Deep under the streets of Paris are the remains of perhaps the greatest act of iconoclasm of the whole French Revolution. These stones are all that remains today of the huge royal jail, the Bastille, the ultimate symbol of royal despotism. But the revolutionaries turned it from a symbol of cruelty into an emblem of freedom.
In the days before the storming of the Bastille, Parisians were, to say the least, agitated. They'd been concerned that the city was surrounded by royal troops, and it was. We get Parisians starting to arm themselves. And the reason they stormed the Bastille is Parisians are furious. They want to take over the prison because they want the guns and the gunpowder that they believe are in there. That's why they march on this symbol. But it is also incredibly symbolically significant. It is the symbol of despotism.
After a day-long siege, the Bastille's defenders were overwhelmed. Soon, the situation turned ugly. The prison governor was decapitated by the angry crowd and his head stuck on a pike.
The people who'd stormed the Bastille begin to demolish it. This incredibly powerful symbol of royal despotism is being razed to the ground, brick by brick, by the people themselves. This is the Place de la Bastille, the greatest, biggest, emptiest space probably left by an act of iconoclasm in Paris.
For me, the siege of the Bastille led to one of the great symbolic transformations. It lies here, in a storehouse in Rouen, 100 kilometres from Paris.
Straight after the fall of the Bastille in July 1789, the Commune, a new revolutionary government of Paris, were hearing that the people of Paris had started to dismantle the Bastille. The Commune decided they needed to take action. They needed to show that the violence was over, that they were in control of space, and that included all acts of violence against powerful symbols.
The official responsible for the dismantling of the Bastille, Pierre-François Palois, understood the powerful messages communicated by symbols. He produced dozens of models of the building and sent them to all 83 départements of France. Now, the Bastille no longer symbolized the despotic power of royalty.
As a result, this kind of plaster model ended up
being circulated around France by Palois in his entrepreneurial mode, so that groups of French people could celebrate this act of iconoclasm. Others would call it vandalism. I wouldn't. And they could march together in revolutionary festivals, perhaps on Bastille Day. It's just such a beautifully detailed piece of work. The windows, 2 of them, still bear bars. It makes me wonder whether Palois and his team are actually using metal from the Bastille. Certainly, much of the metal that was salvaged from the site was being cast into souvenirs and sold. Whether or not it's from the Bastille, every single set of windows bears the signs of having had bars as a really prominent reminder of what a fortress prison this really was. This isn't just an incredibly detailed model of the Bastille, it's a message that's being sent to the Département of France, that the storming of the Bastille wasn't just the efforts of the Parisians, it was an effort made by the nation on behalf of the whole nation.
The storming of the Bastille frightened the new Parisian government. They needed to take control of the situation, and they needed money. Their eyes turned to the wealth of the churches of Paris in what was to be the first act of officially sponsored iconoclasm.